Zenless Zone Zero debuted with a lot of cool ideas, from peak brain rot marketing to finely tuned animations. It's a game that engages the player in a story through immersive cutscenes, overworld interactions, and victory poses that can make you look stupidly stylish, or just make you look stupid. For a game filled with street shop interactions, motorcycle races, and comical characters, there's a lot to like about it. But then there's people like me who look for something new, watch a video on that topic at 2x speed, and let the part of my ego that worries about wasting time on something I might not enjoy stop me from giving anything new a fair shot in the first place. So we're making a change. But first, we have to acknowledge what went wrong and what changed. On Zenless Zone Zero's release, there were 3 major critiques: the super jello-y animation, the tedious gameplay mode, and the writing. Of course, while the significance of these critiques will vary from person to person, there are some things you can objectively look at, starting with animation. One of the first things most people notice about the animation is there's a lot of it. Whether you're looking at a simple walk cycle or the way a character expresses himself, there's a lot of personality packed behind every movement. And to many, this was a very welcome aesthetic. However, not everyone shared this sentiment. While the constant squishing and stretching scratched the ADHD itch for some of us, for others, seeing the exaggerated expressions and poses used even in moments of higher tension made the story feel less sincere.
Why you made me drink all that?
Of course, the right amount of comedic relief for any scenario is going to be subjective, and if nothing else, the animation overall is stylish as hell and just a lot of fun to look at. But for some, seeing every moment conveyed by this excessive motion started to meet the significance of any motion, which made it a true breath of fresh air to finally see a sincere moment conveyed through absolute stillness.
Casa. Take them with you.
While the story does feature relatable tropes, plot-relevant scenes, and cartoony acting at times, they also serve as a reminder not everything has to be taken seriously to set up an interesting story. A lot of the characters exhibit pretty obvious tropes in the first minute of meeting them, but over time, the animation gives these characters opportunities to stand apart from their first impressions, adding layers to their personalities that would otherwise be difficult to authentically convey in that first minute of meeting them. The game tacks on a lot of exaggeration and motion that can feel overwhelming, but at the same time, it would be remiss to say it doesn't make an effort to slow down every now and then to make the climactic moments count. A good story doesn't need to have a deep, dramatic setup to be interesting, but it is nice to see when a story takes the time to appreciate the moments that make the characters feel more alive than any amount of over-animation could. Now, when it comes to gameplay, most agree the combat is satisfying without being too complex, and the side stories and event quests are a worthwhile experience. However, the most common complaint about the game were the repetitive bouts of moving across squares, pushing squares to other squares, and feeling like more time was spent just getting to the next fight than actually fighting. The TV mode did offer a novel mechanic with its roguelike progression and a maze-like setting, but to many, it felt like a welcome mechanic that overstayed its welcome. Going from watching an animated cutscene to basically watching the same thing play out in a 2D maze format for 5 to 10 minutes, only to be rewarded with 2 minutes of combat, was a disproportionate experience for many. So, after Chapter 3, the developers made the TV mode and the main story optional, and created an entirely separate 3D mode to cater to both players. The TV mode aside, everything else about the game was fairly inoffensive. The pacing of resource gathering and progression were improved, new endgame modes were added, and the freedom to swap between easy and hard difficulties meant you could ignore the barrage of in-game tutorials and just enjoy button mashing your way through the campaign, allowing you to play how you want until you decide it's worth figuring out what the hell you're actually doing. And while the game is playable without reading a single tutorial, it is also pretty rewarding when you finally figure it out and manage to land a 6-tuple parry finisher.
I want a bonus for this!
Eliminating target.
In the beginning, the writing of Zenless Zone Zero seemed to prioritize exaggeration and comic relief over subtlety and sincerity. While the exaggerated tropes made characters easy to grasp at first, the incessant comical behaviors started to feel like they overshadowed the potential for character depth. So much so, to me, it felt more relieving to see a character distance themselves from their own comic relief moments, rather than the comic relief itself.
Ew. Why do I feel embarrassed watching myself act cute?
However, after adjusting my expectations and reading further into the story from a more casual perspective, there were moments where characters showed signs of expanding past their comical tropes, rather than simply reinforcing them. From a devout officer turning their back on their superior for their own sense of justice, to a lazy office worker who finally finds something worth working towards, it was moments like these that caught my attention more than any amount of comic relief had before.
Hermasa, what have you done?
Sorry, little proxy, but I can't let this thing exist in the world. I guess this was my final vacation request.
No, don't fall asleep.
Now, the few moments that stuck out to me didn't suddenly make me forget all the things I didn't like about the game. I stopped playing for a reason, but the one thing that brought me back was seeing an ending that made me smile. One day, I was randomly recommended a stream by Kai Sakota as she played through the ending of Chapter 4, and I decided to see how far it had come. And I realized it came a lot further than I expected, and suddenly found myself needing extra tissues by the time it finished. Wait, that didn't sound right. After having spoiled myself on one of the most climactic moments in the story, I went to see how it built up to that point, and see what the payoff was really like with the proper context. So, what did it look like? From dramatic poses and dynamic camera angles to good old flying bullets and bombastic explosions, the cutscenes were fantastic. But when it came to the visual novel style dialogue, using 3D models rotating through the same 3 to 4 poses used throughout most of the story, it was a noticeable contrast to the high production value seen throughout the rest of the game. While static dialogue and 3D settings are efficient for getting a lot of yapping done, characters still have opportunities to convey themselves through body language and subtle expression changes that show what they're feeling without completely relying on reusing the same 3 to 4 stock animations.
Alright? It's one of my favorite hobbies.
Civil Border Patrol, man.
You wanna die?
You don't scare me.
When it comes to the actual substance of the writing itself, it was hard to overlook how conveniently safe the story felt initially. As someone who enjoys visual novel-style stories, I often overlook the need to have big, expressive animations or even voice acting at times to enjoy the writing. But in those cases, the stories themselves often were more than enough to draw my attention without needing any of the extra flair. So it would follow that the less substance the story has in building up its own characters, the more of those extra flares they tend to need to capture that same attention. For example, when I think back to the Transformers movies, I don't remember much of Shia LaBeouf's character development arc, but I do remember the explosions, the F-16s, Linkin Park, and the giant robot fights.
You want a piece of me? You want a piece? No! I want two!
These movies may not have been the most life-changing, but they remain memorable as a spectacle of their own. And as for Zenless Zone Zero, its consistency between writing and flair feels somewhere in the middle. The beginning chapters tend to follow a linear progression. The main characters are hired to handle conflict. The premise and people involved are introduced. A twist to the initial conflict is later discovered. The characters overcome the conflict, and most of them end the day more or less the same way they started it, with little in the way of discovering new character flaws or overcoming them in a way that feels genuine.
I'll return with you and learn how to be a real bro. I'll start by doing my day-to-day work.
Seeing a character recognize the flaw within them that others can relate to gives something in the story to hold on to. We may not have the answer to the problem we share, but it's interesting to see how a very fictional character deals with a very real problem in a realistic way.
The
like really cool and smart, and you should be treated as such.
Wow, that's,
What's wrong?
Guys tell me that all the time, and I just say, I know. But now that a girl's saying it, I forgot how to take an actual compliment.
We're friends, don't worry about it.
Are you trying to have sex with me?
Not really.
Yeah, I have no idea how to process this.
A main story with minimally flawed characters who can just do what they set out to do isn't a bad story. Someone has to move the plot forward. But the stories that make those characters compelling are typically the ones that aren't afraid to place them in morally gray situations, the ones that reveal what they truly value beyond a simple moral compass, and give us a chance to see something more than just a hero or a villain.
You and Kuwana both have your reasons. Something to consider. But between the both of you, is there really a right answer?
When a story mainly consists of clearly defined good guys beating clearly defined bad guys with few moments of introspection into how either of them came to be who they are, after the initial fight scenes, it becomes difficult for me to stay invested in any one of them in the long run. It's one thing to show a character overcoming an obstacle to achieve some greater goal, but it's another to make me feel the journey they endured, to show what they went through that eventually drove them to achieve what they did in the first place. The initial characters felt kind of light when it came to character depth, but with every new character they release, they seem to add more and more genuine weight to the characterization than the last. Coming back to the game reminded me of one thing: no game is meant to be played every day. If you miss a couple dailies, so be it. Just remember what you're here for in the first place. The last thing that really stuck out to me out of everything else was how the story seemed to turn characters into babies whenever it was convenient for the plot. For example, in this scene, a group of police officers are chasing the baddies deploy a smokescreen, and then they just sit there and lose all sense of object permanence, a skill learned around the age of 4 months. Yet, one of the officers manages to walk straight through the smoke, doesn't call the other officers to him, and just surrenders himself in exchange for some civilians and an additional reason to continue the plotline. Stories that rely on the reader stretching their imagination to make some parts of the plot make sense really depend on how well they make the reader want to stretch their imagination in the first place. Take Fast and Furious 5, for example. It's impossible two Dodge Chargers could drag a 9,000-pound vault through a bank, smash it into civilian vehicles, and weaponize it against the entire Rio de Janeiro police force with 0 civilian casualties. Maybe not, but it'd be fun to see it anyway.
Extreme violence.
Playing through the game a second time helped remind me it's a lot easier to have fun when I'm not trying to find every reason not to. There were things in the game that I didn't care for as much as others, but I can also say the same thing for every game I grew to enjoy anyways. It's just refreshing to see a game learn from its mistakes and go on to write better stories with grounding character moments that feel more immersive than many other games that fail to evolve from the same safe, inoffensive storytelling that it itself was once guilty of in the beginning. As more and more content gets pushed out into the world, it gets harder to discern what is really worth paying attention to. When what's good enough for today is continuously allowed to be good enough for tomorrow, it gets harder for me to find something truly worth caring about. I don't mind reading a story with a slow beginning or watching a new video on a topic I've never cared about before, so long as the content tells me the person behind it cares about their craft and leaves me with an experience that makes me feel like that time was well spent. I came to enjoy the story not because every chapter had a happy ending, but because her executions and the character moments that built up to them made every hard-earned climax a spectacle in their own right. While a story doesn't have the cleanest writing or character development at times, it never fails to show how much it cares about showing the story it does have in the best way possible. There's plenty of faults to be found in a game like this, but it's also one of the few things that gets me to smile anyways.
dust through the night. Ain't nobody could ride like Johnny the Night.